Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Competency-based Education Forum. My name is Kirsten Bayer with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I will be your moderator and technical support for this session. Excuse me, I've been having trouble saying session all week. Today's topic that we're going to be discussing this morning is about CBE. And so before we focus on that and I hand it over to our ICCB team, just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started this morning. As a reminder, all participants on this webinar are in listen-only mode, and you cannot unmute yourselves. If you have questions or comments as the webinar proceeds, you can either post your question in the chat box, or we will have time for a live Q&A session at the end when our presenter is done speaking, and you can raise your hand and then we can facilitate unmuting you if you'd like to speak live. A reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and the presentation and the recordings from today will be up on our CBE forum website within 48 hours, and I will put that website in the chat momentarily. In an effort to be as accessible as possible, this session is offering closed captioning, as well as the recorded session will encompass closed captioning as well. And then just a reminder, if you do have faulty internet connection or you would prefer to call in, you can do so by using the phone number and your original registration email that was sent to you with the link. And I will put that in the chat momentarily if you do need to call in. And then with that, I'm going to hand it off to Whitney Thompson from the Illinois Community College Board to get us started.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Whitney Thompson, the Deputy Director for Workforce Education for the Illinois Community College Board, and we are pleased to be able to bring you this forum today. We know there are a number of other priorities and events going on today, so we're happy to be able to record this and share this out for later viewing. We know that you are all busy. I did want to kind of walk through the agenda here before I kind of give some welcoming remarks. Here in a few minutes, we're going to kick it off with just a competency-based education 101, led by Tiffany Freeze, a principal consultant with CBEN. Charla Long could not be with us today, but Tiffany is in the trenches doing this work as well, and will do a great job in terms of walking us through, what competency-based education really is and the quality framework. And then we will move on to learning more about what competency-based education looks like in the community colleges across the country. Jessica Mason from AIR is going to talk about some of the research that they've done and be able to show you what implementation looks like at community colleges across the nation. Then we're going to take a lunch break or an email break or snack break, coffee break, etc. For about an hour and come back together at 1:15 for an afternoon session with Christy Amato, who is the Dean of E-Learning from St. Clair Community College in Ohio. This college has been doing competency-based education for I think close to 8 or 9 years and has a number of programs. And so she's going to walk through program development, faculty engagement, student support, also talk about cost consideration. So some of those very specific topics that I know many of you are interested in. And then we'll close it together, talk about next steps and resources. Specifically, I want to talk about how the Community College Board wants to support our community college system in CBE development and scaling. All right. So how did we get here? Well, there has been a growing interest among our system for CBE for some time, for a number of years. And so, inequity has obviously been a priority for Illinois higher education. So, and these two pair really closely together. We feel that equity, a way to achieve equity could be through competency-based education for a number of reasons. We also feel that, even though I don't like to say a silver lining to COVID-19 just because of the number of lives lost, I think maybe a silver lining to the disruption to our systems caused by COVID-19 means that I think there's, since higher education is slow to change, similar to government, because we have experienced such disruption and have had to shift, I think more changes and more shifts, I think are much easier to do once you've kind of went through a time of disruption. And I think there's a number of changing expectations for our colleges and for education and training providers for work in general. So I think the time is right for more change. And while we've seen, significant enrollment declines, a Strata survey in 2020 revealed that adults are very interested in coming back to higher education over the next 5 years, mostly for career changes, upskilling. And so we want to make sure that we're ready for them when they do come back to us. And again, these are our sort of non-traditional students, not the 18 to 24 who we usually see, although community colleges are very attuned to the adult population. So interest remains high for many non-degree programs, which allows for flexible options. And students have a concern for the cost of higher ed being worth it. And so competency-based education, because of its close alignment to employers and the workforce, and the way that it is structured that really makes sense for students, I think it can really set the tone for some change in our community college system and improve outcomes for students. So at the beginning of this year, 2021, we embarked on a project called the Illinois Equity Collaboratory, participating as a part of a team that CBEN and JFF were leading across multiple institutions across the nation. The participating colleges in this consortium are listed here on the screen, and I want to recognize them. They've done a lot of work, a lot of meetings since about March on competency-based education. Parkland, Elgin, Triton, City Colleges, Black Hawk, and Rend Lake, to name a few. And the goal of this collaboratory was really to help institutions and systems action plan in order to use competency-based education to achieve more equitable outcomes. So we are coming to a close for this collaboratory here in October. And the meetings have really primed us for an action plan that CBEN has put together for institutions and systems to use. So before I turn it over to Tiffany, I did want to thank everyone for coming today, and also Marcus Brown, our Deputy Director for Academic and Student Success. If you're on, I know you've been engaged in some work with early childhood education, prior learning assessment, and so there is some pockets of work going on here in Illinois in this space, and I just wanted you to be able to weigh in and talk about that context as well. Kirsten, can you unmute Marcus?
Yes, hold on 1 second. Okay, Marcus, you should be able to unmute yourself now and turn your video on if you want.
Okay, I think I'm on.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, so we've been working now for about a year, working with early childhood education folks, in particular, working on competency-based education approach, looking at really taking what we know are competencies that funnel the gateways, entitlements and gateway competencies, and looking at ways that we can infuse those into the classroom and assess for those in sort of a learning competency kind of way. So we really had a chance to kind of review that using immersion technology to do that as we continue to sort of think through other pathways, particularly in early childhood education. We're looking at other ways in collaboration with CBEN and some others to look at prior learning assessment and how that might be useful in terms of structuring assessments for that. Certainly thinking about ways that we can think through competency-based assessment pathways that aren't necessarily full-fledged competency-based programs, but looking at ways to assess competencies along the way, including modularizations and how we might think through how we deliver some of the courses that we do now. So a lot of that work has really come through the early childhood area, but also thinking through other ways and other areas that we might be able to also scale that up or think about competency in that way.
Awesome, thanks, Marcus. So now I am very pleased to turn it over to Tiffany Fries, Principal Consultant at CBEN, and I'll let her introduce herself. We know she has some other titles and expertise, and she's going to be walking us through Competency-based Education 101.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take just a second here to share my screen. Make sure are you able to see my screen? Okay, great. Thank you so much for having CBEN be a part of today's forum. Like Whitney said, my name is Tiffany Fries. I serve as a principal consultant for the Competency-based Education Network. I do also wear another hat. I serve as the Chief Assessment Officer for an organization called the Quilts Institute. It's a competency-based organization. We build competency-based programs mostly in the healthcare space. And so I just wanted to let you know I've been in shoes where we've been building competency-based programs, and part of my role as a principal consultant for CBEN is to help others build programs, scale programs, explore CBE and what that means for your learner population and for your needs at your institution or organization. So I'm very happy to be here today. My background is actually in the behavioral sciences, and so you might hear me reference that as we're talking about competency-based education, particularly when we talk about assessment and building that learning journey towards performance. So to kick it off today, I know we're doing CBE 101. I just want to make sure you all feel comfortable in interacting. So part of this workshop or presentation today is really about getting those questions answered and ensuring that people feel comfortable in where they are in exploring a program or building a program in CBE, or credential level strategy, I should say. So please feel free to put questions in the chat. I know that in order to raise your hand and ask a question, you'll have to be unmuted, but if you'll absolutely feel comfortable raising your hand, we can unmute you or put your question in the chat. I'd love to have some discussion and dialogue as needed in order for you all to get what you need out of today. So again, we're doing CBE. We're talking about competency-based education, and really at the core of it, as we all know, are competencies. So what that means is really identifying that strong set of competencies. If those are identified and defined well, which you'll hear me reference quite a lot, looking for that operational definition. Are they defined in a way that makes them observable? And most importantly, measurable. That is what everything else is built on. That is the core or the foundation that we're going to build any type of credential level program, strategy, course, anything on as that operationally defined set of competencies. When we talk about a competency, we are talking about a range of performance indicators is how we actually refer to them. Some people say behavioral indicators, sub-competencies. What we're talking about is all of those threads or indicators that define what a competency is. How will we know it when we see it? How do we know what it looks like? That includes knowledge. That includes skills and abilities. It includes what we reference as intellectual behaviors. And it also includes that transfer of learning. So when we talk about knowledge, we talk about what does that learner need to know? What are the theories or ideas that undergird that particular application of a skill? What is the terminology, for example? What is the knowledge that really supports application of any skill in the workplace? Skills and abilities. what does the learner need to be able to do, right? They may have knowledge behind it, but then how do I apply it? What do those skills look like? Intellectual behaviors. You'll hear intellectual behaviors referenced as so many different things like non-cognitive skills, things like soft skills, grit. You know, you'll hear all different types of references for intellectual behaviors. CBEN actually uses the term intellectual behaviors because we do believe that these competencies or threads of competencies can be taught. So if you can define something, you can in turn measure it and teach it, right? And so when we talk about intellectual behaviors, we do talk about things like relationship building, problem solving. It can also include those what we might refer to as soft skills, but we know life and work is very difficult without them. The application and transfer. So most importantly, we're all driving to outcomes in the workforce, right? Our graduates, our learners, whoever our learner population is, whether that's a workforce population, whether that's in an academic institution, the ability to apply and transfer that learning, those relevant knowledge, skills, abilities, intellectual behaviors into the meaningful environment is what's most important. And at that identified and targeted level. So if I'm a frontline worker, for example, can I apply those competencies at the appropriate targeted level? If I'm a supervisor, for example, if I'm a graduate student versus an associate's degree learner, am I able to apply and transfer my learning at that appropriate level? So it's really about understanding the theory of whatever that competency is, that knowledge behind it, the skills and dispositions to successfully apply it at all of these, at the levels in the relevant situation. So it's a focus on what's needed to be successful, really on those outcomes. When we talk about competency-based education, we also talk about actual student learning. We talk about the design. We talk about how learner progress is measured. We talk about demonstration of competence. You'll hear a lot about rigorous assessments. You might hear terms like mastery, proficiency, what's required for a particular competency. So when we talk about competency-based education, the focus, you'll hear this a lot, the focus is on actual student learning. We are less concerned, this does not mean it's not relevant, but we are less concerned, right, with seat time. We're less concerned with credit hour, accumulation. We're really focused on student learning. Some of those other pieces might be a part of that, absolutely. So please hear me say that. But we are concerned about actual student learning, the application of that learning, rather than the time spent in class or pure just participation, right? Learner progress is measured. It's measured by demonstration of competence. And the way that we measure demonstration of competence is through a system or a strategy, which we'll talk about today, of rigorous assessments. That really means we want that learner to prove what they know and can do. We want them to prove they've mastered or become proficient in a predefined set of knowledge and skills. That is what's required for a particular competency or area of study. So when we talk about competency-based education, you're going to hear a lot of these different words said quite a lot. Key differentiators of CBE. So what makes CBE CBE? Again, it's a focus on what the learner knows and can do. That is why, and like Whitney mentioned at the beginning, it's why it's directly aligned to workforce, right? We're really concerned about what that learner knows and can do. What learning experiences are they potentially bringing in with them that they could show at the beginning of a program, for example? What are they leaving with? What are we going to be able to guarantee employers that learners can do when they leave as a graduate of our programs? Mastery or proficiency is required. We do require a demonstration of that, like we've already talked about. Time is variable. It's, again, that does not mean time is not sometimes a component of CBE. Sometimes it is, but we're less concerned about time. Time can be variable. The focus is that learning is fixed. Everyone must learn with the same outcomes or must leave with the same outcomes rather than a certain amount of time spent in a seat. CBE is flexible. It means that we offer different learning opportunities for different learner populations, for example. We might offer different ways to engage in that learning, such as modality. Maybe it's online, maybe it's a hybrid program, maybe it's face-to-face. That flexibility is really able to reach different learner populations that potentially wouldn't have had that accessibility in other traditional types of programs. So a focus of CBE and a differentiator is that the learning journeys are planned in a flexible manner. They're pre-planned. It's not something that I'm planning for my class tomorrow or my course tomorrow, right? It is pre-planned. It's a pre-planned, explicit, and intentional learning journey. That's why we use a backward design process, which we'll talk about in depth today. But we do use a backward design curricular journey, meaning that we identify that competency set on the front end. That's step number one. We operationally define those competencies or behaviorally define those competencies, determine how those will be measured, and then we build a learning journey that sequences and scaffolds that learner to desired performance. It is performance-based. Everything about CBE means it's about what the learner knows and can do and that they're able to show it. It's criterion referenced, meaning that there are predetermined criteria that you are going to map that learner behavior against, right? So when the learner is showing what they know and can do, we have criteria that are predetermined that you're going to say, yes, those demonstrations meet or do not meet that competency area. Or there might be different levels of meeting that competency or showing proficiency on that competency. And that's all done through authentic assessments. That means that we're going to mirror that workplace environment as closely as possible. Those authentic assessments mean that they're relevant, they're meaningful, and they mirror the workplace. CBE takes a personalized approach to wraparound supports. Again, meaning we support learners in ways that promote success, in ways that give those learners what they need to be successful, whether that be, there are different programs who look at offering childcare. There are different programs that meet each learner where they are, ensure they have all of those right supports, ensure that they know they're in the right program fit, right? A best fit for their life, their goals, their needs. There's really this focus on a personalized approach to wrap around student supports. CBE teaching and learning. The approach CBE takes is really one of 4 different areas. We look at program design, program standards, academic grading, and faculty roles. These are kind of continued differentiators in essence. So when we talk about program design, there's this question about modality. There's often a misconception, that CBE is only online. That is not true. CBE is delivered in several modalities, right? And there's an option for face-to-face delivery. There's an option for virtual delivery. There's an option for hybrid. Really, CBE approach is just how that program is designed. And then what technologies we use to power that if virtual is one of those, one of the modalities chosen to deliver that program. As Whitney referenced earlier, it's labor market aligned. We're gathering evidence from what's relevant in the workplace, what are employers looking for, what industry stakeholders are necessary to bring to the table. How do we align what our graduates leave with, right, the outcomes, with what's needed in the workforce, what's relevant and meaningful. And then there's the flexibility. Again, we want to reach learners who may not traditionally be reached by other programs. We want to allow for accessibility and equity in many different ways. And building our programs in a flexible manner often reaches learners who may not otherwise have had the opportunity to seek a credential. Program standards, really eliminating those opportunity gaps. This is what we were just speaking to with flexibility, right? But really looking into what are those gaps? What are those challenges those learners are facing? What can we do to help remove those barriers? How can we provide those wraparound student supports to really eliminate those opportunity gaps and ensure that all learners have accessibility to pursue credentials to improve their lives and their and where they're moving in the workforce. Academic grading. With competency-based education, you'll often hear the terms mastery, proficiency. You'll also hear us often say there's no one right way, right? But academic grading is sort of like the seat thing. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It's just not the focus. So you'll often hear us say mastery because we're talking about a competency with very specific indicators of what it means to be, quote, proficient in that area, or what it means to have mastered that area. What it really boils down to is that the learner can show what they know and can do for that competency area. And that's what we reference as mastery rather than A, B, C, D, or, you have a 92, an 81, or, that type of grading scale. It's less about the assignment of a score or a grade than it is about the ability to demonstrate a particular behavior, knowledge, skill, intellectual behavior. This really does help take away that punitive piece of it. And so many of us are conditioned, right, from a very young age to know whether you got an A, B, C, D, or, F, whether you failed or not, but really competency-based education focuses on that repetition. It's okay, in a formative assessment. So one of those practice exercises, one of those activities, those learning activities that's really meant to be a teaching and learning feedback loop. For many reasons, to benchmark learner progress, to give continuous improvement data on the program, to really hone in on that individual learner and where they're presently performing so you can help them grow and fill in any of those learning gaps. So it's okay in competency-based education to have multiple attempts on formative activities. It's okay to not necessarily assign a grade. Some programs do, and that's completely okay. Some programs don't. And they just use those purely for teaching and learning opportunities, safe practice opportunities. So you'll see academic grading as something that each program exploring CBE will consider. Do you assign grades? If you assign grades, what types of activities do you assign grades to? And all of those other questions, because again, there's no one right way to CBE. There's just a lot of different options within some quality standards, which we'll talk about. Faculty roles. When we talk about faculty roles, you'll hear often in competency-based education that faculty roles can be unbundled. Again, they're not always unbundled, but sometimes they are. You'll have the faculty role that is unbundled into program design. You can have specializations. So you might have faculty who are solely responsible and focus on assessment exercises. Some that are solely responsible and focus on instructional coaching. You'll have many different roles that we all know as faculty. I come from higher education faculty role as well. And we did all of that. When we were hired, we were expected to design our courses within a program. You're expected to create your assessments, create your content, get it in the learning platform, deliver it. That was all part of the faculty role. Many competency-based education programs now unbundle that faculty role, and there's a potential for specialization in what area you are able to focus on, whether that be delivery of content, building content, program design, assessment, whatever that specialization might be for you. So a competency-based approach is really about determining those intended outcomes. So you have programmatic faculty and industry partners determine needed competencies. So it's a collaboration. You have a collaboration between faculty in higher ed, industry partners that can include Chamber of Commerce, a labor workforce board. It could be employer partners. Those stakeholders can vary widely depending on who you bring to the table and who should be at the table, helping determine what are those outcomes needed, including faculty, right? Faculty absolutely are the subject matter experts in their area, in that curriculum, in those programs. So it's really about a partnership determining what those needed competency areas are and that needed competency set looks like for those that particular set of learners. Collectively, you define those competencies, really talking about what does that look like? That is something that comes out of my mouth quite a bit when we talk about operational definitions or behaviorally defined. It really boils down to what does that look like? What does it look like in the workplace? If you were to walk in, you're talking about a competency area, you were to walk in and say that worker right there or that learner right there, they're competent in fill in the blank, right? What does that look like? What is it that they're doing to demonstrate that they are proficient in that competency? So that helps you determine expected learner performance. That is that set of predetermined criteria that we know it when we see it, and then we are able to validly and reliably measure it. So when you talk about competency-based education, we also talk about the fact that faculty pre-write formative and summative assessments. This is often, I'm just going to be completely honest, often brings up the question about academic freedom, right? And all of that sort of thing. But when you really boil down to intentional learning journey, this is really just the best practice in education anyways, that we are designing our instructional learning journeys prior to deliveries, right? We should not be, writing our tests or our exams on the way to class. This is something that faculty should be pre-planning and pre-designing and intentionally designing that learning journey, those scoring rubrics. I know what I'm expecting from my learners to demonstrate this knowledge or skill set in order to be proficient. That happens on the front end in competency-based education. Developing learner competence. We're all working to create learning pathways, right? So as we talked about in the beginning, a CBE backward design approach is that we have that identified competency set, and then we determine how those competencies will be measured, and we create those learning pathways, which include both the content, that learning journey, including those formative assessment activities and your summative assessment activity. How are we sequencing materials and scaffolding learning in a way that builds that learner to performance? There are assigned faculty who teach using pre-planned materials. That might be the faculty who designed it. That may not be if you're using an unbundled faculty role. Either way, that learning journey is intentionally designed in a pre-planned manner. So there are no gaps, it has been intentionally designed so it can be explicitly taught. And then you verify outcomes are achieved. This really drills down to that assessment piece. Learners are expected to demonstrate competencies at a required level, which we'll talk about leveling here in a minute, to progress or complete. So there is an identified level, whether that be an employment level, right? So it could be that your outcomes are your intention for performance at the end, right? Might be at a frontline worker level if you have an employment pipeline. It might be at an associate's degree level if you're talking about an academic pipeline. It's whatever that level that's been targeted for that set of learners that would be expected. Now, when you're talking about building your learner to performance, so maybe that end state performance is an associate's degree, what does that learning journey look like? Where are they expected to be performing at any given point along their learning journey? They must demonstrate competence at that targeted level in order to complete, which is your end state, right? Or progress along the way. So I need my learner to be here at this level of learning. Maybe it's a foundational knowledge level of learning before they can move on to performance level of learning in order for them to complete and demonstrate competence. So learners are given the time and resources they need to reach competence. That's all part of the competency-based approach. When you talk about the faculty, the coach, people are calling it all different things these days, but the faculty, the coach, that instructional coach, they're the guide on the side, right? We are moving away from that sage on the stage approach, which I'm sure many of you have heard that terminology, and you're the guide on the side. You are absolutely there to support that learner. You give them the time, the resources they need to be successful and demonstrate competence. Programmatic faculty will review each semester, so it is important that continuous improvement process. You ensure for inter-rater reliability, make curriculum adjustments as needed, so you really just dig into that data. What is the data telling me about the curriculum? Are there gaps in content? Are my assessments right? Are they valid and reliable? And then post-completion, learner review for efficacy. So we ensure that we follow our graduates, right? Are they successful in the workforce? Did they get what they need? Where can we use that data to, again, improve our programs? So you'll see in here.
We have a question in the chat, and I just thought since you were talking about outcomes, it might be a good time to
absolutely.
Ask it. Yeah, so a couple slides back, you had shared that CBE can help eliminate opportunity gaps or potential barriers for students. Someone is asking about if you could share any examples of how CBE can do that, or ways in which you've seen CBE do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, a program that I used to work with, and one of the first competency-based models I helped design, for example, we had many adult learners who came from military backgrounds, just as an example. They were able to bring in all of their military experience. Many of them were often leaders, and they had a wide range of leadership competencies that were very difficult in other ways to, for example, prior learning assessment into an institution. The program that was built was an organizational leadership program where we assessed and coached or taught competencies like problem solving and decision making, relationship building, influence. It was a leadership model. It was actually a nationally recognized leadership model that's used by Nike, Callaway, Wendy's, PetSmart. So we had connected the higher ed model or academic model with the workforce in that way, so that those competency areas that we assessed for in a prior learning assessment model connected directly to the workforce and leadership competencies that were recognized in the organizational world, right? In the business world. So for example, those learners who might not have otherwise pursued a credential because they were an adult learner, they had families, multiple jobs, potentially, they were able to bring that leadership experience in. And that particular model, they could go through a competency-based assessment. It was a full day simulated, it was a full simulated work day. So an 8-hour work day where they went through 6 exercises that assessed for 15 competency areas and could earn up to 36 hours of college level credit that could be embedded in different credentials. So that's one example of many of the adult learners, I guess the adult learner population that was more difficult to reach, gave them an opportunity to come in, show what they knew, what they could do from their prior learning experiences, bring it into an academic model and pursue a credential that they may not have otherwise been able to do. So that's one example. Happy to give more if that's helpful. And I wish I could hear people, but I don't know if that was helpful because I can't see faces either.
The feedback is that was helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, again, please feel free to chime in. Happy to give other examples, but thank you for the question. So you will see, and kind of building off of that, that was one model that's unique, right? But there is such a wide range of models. So again, and you're going to hear me say this again, there's no one right way. There's a right framework. There's right standards to follow that which we'll go through, but there's not one right way. So there's a wide range of models nationally. There's really a continuum of a CBE framework. You have everything from course-based, which people might introduce discrete competencies into a single course, all the way to people who have no courses, no credit hours. They just have to know the competencies, right? At the end, the learner has to be able to demonstrate competencies in order to earn a credential. So you have a wide range of how people structure their competency-based credentials and how people, I should say programs, how they decide to offer those programs and what elements of competency-based education that they adopt. So you have everything, again, from learning measured by seat time. You've got courses tied to credit hours, and teachers or those instructors creating the assessments in the full faculty role. And then you have everything all the way on the other side of the continuum where learning is measured by direct assessment. It's completely untethered from the credit hour is what that means. And you have them, people using standardized tools to evaluate and assess. For example, the situation I just gave where we had adopted a competency model from the business world. That was a standardized competency model that's being used with different organizations out in the corporate world. So you have a wide range and continuum of how people are adopting and building competency-based education credentials. You have a variety amongst universities and colleges. So you have everything from, and you've probably heard of several of these, Western Governors University, online modality, right? You have Purdue University, online or face-to-face. You have Alverno College, which is a women's, it's a women's college in, I think it's Wisconsin, and they actually use in-person, what they call assessment center model, where they put people in a simulated workday, just like the example I was just giving. You have a wide range, Southern New Hampshire University, which I'm sure you've heard of, a wide range of universities and colleges who all offer CBE credentials, and the ways and the manner in which they do that can look very different. And that's okay, because again, at the core, those standards are there and those elements are present that hallmark CBE. You'll see a variety amongst community college. So we have the Kentucky colleges, the Kentucky Community and Technical College System in Kentucky. That's a system of 16 institutions who are building a competency-based, I should say planning what it would look like if they built a competency-based education model. So they're just exploring. You have Austin Community College, Salt Lake Community College, which is a very technical programs. So there are a lot of different examples of what, again, competency-based education looks like across the different levels, from university to community college level, technical college level, significant interest by employers. So that particular model I was referencing earlier, you'll see organizations using competency models in industry. So Nike, Amazon, Walmart, Tractor Supply Company, many employers are looking at competency modeling and skills-based approaches to delivering education. So the different CBE models, again, there are a lot of myths. And so oftentimes it's just about asking those questions. What are the different CBE models? The U.S. Department of Education recognizes 3 approaches to competency-based education programs. We've talked about this already a little bit, but you can have that course and credit-based. Even though you use a competency model, it's still packaged like you would think of any other program. You might package the competencies in a course structure, whether that be by one competency area, whether that be by several discrete competencies thread into a course. Again, the packaging is really about the needs of your program, but it can still be in that course structure with credit hours assigned to those courses. And that is considered a competency-based education model as well, as long as, again, you follow that design and that competency-based framework. Direct assessment, CBE, is about untethering from that credit hour. So again, you might not have course structure at all. It might be purely by demonstration of competency areas and is completely untethered from that credit hour. So the U.S. Department of Education does recognize that approach to CBE as well. And you might have a mix of those. You might have a hybrid version of competency-based education as well. So institutions with direct assessment authority, this is, sorry, let me get back here for a minute. This is where, I don't know if many of you are familiar, many of you may absolutely be familiar with the experimental sites that happened several years ago. Goodness, it's been about 5 or 6 years ago now, I think, where the U.S. Department of Education and the federal government was really giving authority to institutions to look at what direct assessment would mean, which means untethered from the credit hour. The way federal financial aid is currently structured, or was currently structured, was that federal financial aid was tied to the credit hour. And so what did that look like? It was really about what does it look like if it's not, which is what direct assessment means. So institutions currently, this many years later, that have authority for direct assessment programs is what you see on the screen here. So American Public University System, Brandman, Capella, Southern New Hampshire, many of these you've probably heard of, Walden University, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. So there are schools now that, institutions now that do have authority to use a direct assessment model from the federal government. When we talk about components of a competency-based education approach, you've heard me reference today several different things. You've heard me reference curricular design. You've heard me reference student supports, wraparound student supports, technology. So when you're talking about a CBE approach, there are many elements to consider, but they kind of become packaged in 3 primary areas. One is curricular design. How is that program being designed? Is it using a backward design model? What elements are being adopted? Those are all, that's one of the big kind of packages of the CBE approach. Another is technology. For example, if you are offering an online program, if your modality is online, again, doesn't have to be, even if you're face-to-face, even if you're offering a hybrid approach, what are the technologies you're using to power your CBE program? That could be everything from considering, how are we tracking student data? How are we handling the enrollment process and something that might not be tethered to course structure? How are we powering our assessments? If we're talking about performance-based and we have online delivery, many learning platforms don't offer necessarily a wide range of native tools for assessment, right? So how are we being creative in using those tools? How are we bringing in other technologies needed to power higher levels or performance-based types of assessment? So thinking through those technologies that are needed to power a CBE approach. And that human touch. CBE absolutely believes in those wraparound student supports. I want to emphasize that. So where does that human touch come in? It is absolutely an approach that really emphasizes that student support. How do we make our programs accessible? How do we encourage perseverance? How do we get learners to persist and complete? How do we support them and help remove their barriers? So really that human touch is essential. Even if we power some of that through technology, where do we get that human touch as well? So just thinking through those three components or those three kind of big buckets of what it means to have a CBE approach. When we talk about curricular design, you'll often hear a reference to Bloom's taxonomy. So you'll hear, like we talked about earlier, that knowledge. What is that foundational level that a learner needs? What is that undergirding theory, knowledge, terminology, just all of that will support the application or the performance of a certain competency set. And then you'll see it build, right? So then will the learner be able to use that information? Will they be able to apply it, analyze, evaluate, create? So how do we build that learner through those levels of learning to reach performance? When we think about curricular design and competency-based education, we absolutely believe in and often reference Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is it's cognitive levels of learning. We also believe there's a behavioral component to that, which again, I promised you in the beginning, you'd hear me reference those behavioral sciences, right? So we are absolutely building that learner through those cognitive levels of learning. We also have to work in conjunction with that and turning that into application and behavior, right? So how are we then seeing that expressed? How are we seeing it expressed at the different levels of learning? How are we seeing it expressed in the workplace when it's transferred? The cognitive levels of learning mixed with those behavioral levels of learning, they work together for a learner to reach that proficiency and performance-based, that they're able to demonstrate and successfully perform ultimately in the workplace. I often like to reference shooting a free throw, right? So I get the question a lot, so I'll just put it out there. I often get the question, well, wouldn't you be teaching to the test? If you make a rubric transparent, or if you explicitly teach such and such, you're teaching to the test. No, right? When we're talking about performance, we're talking about expectations of what behavior should look like. That's explicit, right? So I often reference shooting a free throw. If I have any basketball lovers or players out there, if I'm teaching you to shoot a free throw, right, I'm going to tell you, you need to bend your knees. When you shoot, you need to extend that arm, right? Your elbow should be straight. You should make the gooseneck. If you have any of those, again, those basketball players out there, you're going to be explicit about the performance expected, those performance expectations, just as it should be in the workplace, right? So we often talk about those levels of learning, sequencing and scaffolding. All of them are important. There's kind of some benchmarks. The identify level, right? Can I identify what's important in shooting a free throw, for example? I could write out the steps, right? Could I identify them in a list? Bend my knees, make the gooseneck, straighten my knees when I'm fully extended. How accurate am I? Being able to identify the steps necessary is absolutely a level of learning that's foundational knowledge to being able to do it. Recognizing it, right? If I were to watch a video of somebody doing it, can I recognize successful performance, what it looks like, what it does not look like, what should it look like? Can I recognize what it looks like in the workplace? And then can I demonstrate it myself? So you kind of have those benchmarks leading to performance that we like to talk about. So talking about competencies as a currency is really a shift in thinking. We've been in a framework where we don't talk about competencies as the currency typically. And there's really a shift in both the corporate world, although it's been in existence for quite some time. And now it's starting to be quite a conversation and a method of currency in higher education as well. And absolutely in that currency between higher education and the workforce, for example. So we really, if we start shifting our thinking to what learners know and can do rather than what credit hours they have and how those have accumulated into a credential, that's how we can begin having more meaningful conversations and relationships with our industry partners and outcomes, successful outcomes for our graduates. So really, again, starting to shift our thinking to competencies as currency. So we have a lot of pioneering efforts in the movement. This is both employers as well as in higher education. So you have many efforts on the employer or industry fronts. For example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. It's really a powerful partnership opportunity. It's a nationwide organization dedicated to educating the public on how business is keeping America strong and creating those opportunities. So again, it's that connection to how important the workforce is. And I think that's become ever more apparent and illustrated through our recent pandemic. So all of those efforts that are taking place across the nation right now, not just in higher education, but in industry as well. SHRM's Talent Assessment Center, so that's the Society for Human Resources Management. They have a talent assessment center where you can actually, employers can go and research assessments that can be used and evaluate how they can evaluate their workforce, how they can hire for certain skill sets, how they can succession plan certain skill sets, how they can really, again, start looking at skills and competencies in a way that's been done differently. So it's not just about a credential anymore. It's really about what their employees know and can do. The federal government has really moved to skills-based hiring. Again, it's less about what credential you come out with than it is about what you're able to do in the role and if you're successful in your job role. Higher education is looking at the credential engine. And if any of these, you're able to Google most of these and see what work is being done in each of these areas. But the credential engine is a nonprofit organization really working to map the credential landscape with clear and consistent information. So what does a credential mean? What's included in that, right? It's not just that I have a business degree from such and such anymore. It's what does that credential mean that learner knows and can do? And really coming up with consistent language, ways to talk about that, ways to see whether it's relevant and meaningful, right? We have IMS Global Case Standards. So that's the Competencies and Academic Standards Exchange. There's just a lot of work being done in how systems can exchange and manage information about learning standards, competencies, in a way that's consistent. So it's really about the fact that we'd all be speaking the same language. There's a lot of work being done behind that. So we know what it means when you say, so-and-so has a credential from here, right? Or this is the competency that this learner has. What does that mean? So if we can make that meaningful, we'd all be speaking the same language. You'll see now that we have competency-based apprenticeship. So it's about what you're able to do. Again, training for a particular trade, ensuring that you have the knowledge and skills to be successful in that role. You'll see apprenticeship programs popping up in pre-K through 12 movements. We have the Open Skills Network, which is about, again, it's about a coalition of employers, education providers, military, all of those stakeholders dedicated to advancing those skills-based education and hiring. So looking at the skills, people are focused in on what people know and can do. You have that comprehensive learner record. So connecting the learner record with employment records, supporting the nature of academics and workplace recognition and achievements. So really just that alignment between both higher education, the academic world, with industry and employment. There have been big shifts in the pre-K-12 space. So there's been a big move towards CBE with transcription. So looking at how learners can move from potentially programs, a pre-K-12 pipeline right into higher education. How is that transcribed? Again, can we use competencies as a currency? You'll see New Hampshire has led the way since 2005, and many other states are following. So Ohio, Virginia, Florida, South Carolina, you can see all the states there that people are really shifting their thinking, even in that pre-K-12 world. You'll see that the NCSL Student-Centered Learning Commission, they're really working. So the National Conference of State Legislators, sorry, it's a group of state legislators that are studying policy options, obstacles, recommendations to help states move forward with systems and support student-centered learning opportunities, CBE being one of them. They're really working to help set the vision, prioritize equity, elevate the teaching profession, and address the whole child. So those are all of the shifts going on in the pre-K-12 world, which certainly is a pipeline into our programs as well. Recent changes to regional accreditation. This is something that was a very interesting shift. So when we talk about regional accreditors, it's always been a conversation where we've been assigned to accreditors, right? Depending on where we are in the nation. Now systems and institutions can accreditor shop. You can, that's kind of an interesting way to put it, but you are not tied to one particular accreditor anymore. So accreditors are certainly being creative and being, and really looking at the forefront of higher education right now in what do we need to do, right, to be a sought after accreditor? What do we need to do? How do we need to be cutting edge? How do we need to be forward thinking? Accreditors are really looking for ways to differentiate themselves now that schools have options for accreditors to evaluate their programs. So that's just an interesting policy and regulatory what that policy and regulatory environment and landscape is looking like. The recent negotiated rulemaking process, really the US Department of Education is really looking at funding priorities and how the landscape of education, higher education is looking and what rules need to be put around those opportunities as well. US Congress is looking into education, right? Higher education. So there's bipartisan support for the concept that solution, it's driving to that solution that's still a challenge, but support for the concept is a big step forward. Right now, Republicans are wanting to fully authorize CBE programs, for example. Democrats want to authorize demonstration projects. Both of those things, just the fact that across the board right now, both parties want to authorize performance-based programming, what learners know and can do. So something to consider there as you think about policy and regulatory environment of higher education. So when we talk about exchanging competencies, it connects all types of initiatives. So even from a kind of a CBEM perspective and working with programs nationally, internationally, there are all different types of initiatives going on at the same time. Oftentimes we see in systems, we see in institutions, you'll see credit for prior learning. There might be a committee working on credit for prior learning. They're talking about micro-credentials, continuing education, military-based learning, future of work, stackable credentials, work-based learning, on-ramps and off-ramps. What do our learning records look like? You'll see all of these different initiatives. And when you really drill into competency-based education, it really connects all of these different types of initiatives because these are all elements and considerations for competency-based education. How do we stack those credentials, those micro credentials into a credential, right? How do I, as a learner, come in, show what I know through credit for prior learning, and then I'm able to look at those stackable credentials or those modularized, that modularized content, take what I need to earn a credential, and that's my on-ramp and off-ramp, for example. So all these different flexible pathways that are personalized and really drive me to the outcomes I need to be successful in reaching personalized goals. So I think it's right at 11. If you all are interested, I think we could take about a 5-minute break, break it up a little bit and come back about 11:05. Does that sound good, Whitney?
I think that sounds great.
Okay, great. Well, we will take a quick break just to give everyone a breather, get a drink if you would like, and then we will start back at 11:05. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully everyone got a breather. My coworkers and I talk all the time about how this new virtual world that we live in rarely allows for breaks anymore. So hopefully it gave you a little bit of a breather, and thank you for giving me one as well. So just to jump back in, CBEN does have a quality framework for CBE programs. So as you've heard me talk about, I think probably too much so far today, that there's no one right way to build a program. There are quality elements and standards that you would follow for building a program, and there's a lot of flexibility within that as long as you're hitting those quality standards. So we just want to take just a minute to really talk about the quality framework for CBE programs. And as you're exploring or building or scaling any of your programs, the quality framework is always just an excellent go-to to ensure that you're just following those quality standards when building a program. It's important to note that CBEN as an organization, the way that the quality framework was built was through their network of institutions. And so there were many stakeholders at the table from across CBEN membership who created that quality framework, and that's how it came to be. So the quality framework is a collective effort of many individuals and institutions who have built CBE programs. So the CBEN's quality framework is made up of different components. So I will show you here in a few slides how to access CBEN's quality framework. And that's a tool amongst other tools that CBEN puts out through their membership in order to provide, again, just those resources needed when you're really looking at how is this done? How have other people done it? What are tools I can use, and give you those resources to go to and those tools you can use to be successful. So CBEN's quality framework is made up of components, and it really has a structure, a hierarchy where there are different elements of quality. So different elements that would indicate quality of a CBE program or credential. Each of those elements is then broken down into principles, principle, standards, and then development guides. So the element is just a label or shorthand for the principle being described. You'll see what that looks like. It's the title, the name of the name of the bucket that says this is what's important, right? This means quality, and these are the standards. The principle is really a description of that. It's the fundamental proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief, behavior, or chain of reasoning. So you'll just have your element, which is kind of like the title, the principle that describes that, what it means, what it looks like, and then you have standards. That's the level of quality or attainment, and an idea or thing used as a measure, norm, or a model in comparative evaluations. Again, I'll show you what that looks like, but for example, we have an element number 4 that's around assessment. You'll see how that's labeled, but it's about assessment. And then the principle describes that there are about 10 standards that say this is what it should look like, right? This is what how it can be measured or what quality looks like. And then there are development guides. So it's a set of scaffolded performance indicators intended to allow programs to understand stages of development for a CBE program. You'll say, oh, that looks like a rubric, right? So you'll be able to look at that and say, okay, this is useful. So that development guide gives you different levels of what it should look like, and they build upon each other that include expectations from the previous stages. So I'll show you what all of this looks like, but that's the structure of what CBEN's quality framework looks like when you see it. So for example, this is the principle. You'll see that principle number 1, which is about a credential level strategy. This is a principle about the assessment. So it's a credential level assessment strategy. And the principle is that authentic assessments and their corresponding rubrics are key components of CBE, which is anchored by the belief that progress toward a credential should be determined by what learners know and are able to do. The overarching assessment strategy is comprised of assessments designed both to inform the learning journey, often referred to as assessment for learning, right? Your formative assessments, and to validate mastery, often referred to as assessment of learning or your summative assessments. In CBE models, assessments are intentionally aligned. You got that intentional word, right? So we pre-plan it, we have predetermined criteria, are intentionally aligned to competencies and cognitive levels, and use a range of assessment types and modalities to measure the transfer of learning and mastery into varied contexts. Authentic assessment design and use follow best practices for assessment professionals. So the element is element number 4 about a credential level assessment strategy. This would be your principle. It describes what is meant by a credential level assessment strategy. Then your standards would look like the following. So for example, standard number 1 would be that authentic assessments are built within and aligned to an overarching assessment strategy for the competency being measured and the credential being earned. You'll see that there are several standards under each element and principle. So again, just the structure of the quality framework when you're looking at it. Performance indicators. So this is your, I think they called it the practice guide, right? This is what it looks like. For example, if you're saying that the criteria for element number 4 on assessment is that authentic assessments are built within and aligned to an overarching assessment strategy, an initial level of performance, emerging, developed, and highly developed. You'll see it's like a levels of performance, what it
Tiffany,
looks like. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Your slides aren't progressing with us. I don't know if your screen is paused here.
Oh, no, I'm so sorry. Let me go back here. Thank you for saying that. I'm sorry about that. So we have the quality framework, and what I was talking about is just the elements or the components in the definition. So you'll see here that we went through what the element is, the principle under each element, the standards, and the development guide. So let me just go through that. I won't re-say everything. I think you all heard it all, but I'll just show you again so you can see the structure. So every one of CBEN's quality framework elements has under it a principle, those standards, and then a development guide, which looks like a rubric. This is what the principle looks like. So for example, element number 4 about assessment strategy has this principle under it, which talks about what it is, right? What does that mean? What does it look like? It talks about authentic assessments, rubrics, formative and summative assessment, intentional alignment, range of assessment type and modality, transfer of learning into varied contexts, and following best practices for assessment professionals. So the principle defines or describes what that element is or what is meant by it. You then have multiple standards under each that are really kind of indicators. How do I know I'm meeting element number 4, right, of quality? So you'll see things like authentic assessments are built within and aligned to an overarching assessment strategy for the competency being measured and the credential being earned. You'll see things like the assessment strategy and each of the assessments and their corresponding rubrics equitably measure learning outcomes across diverse learner groups while guarding against bias in the formative and summative assessments. So you'll see that these are the standards of that element that is outlined again in the quality framework. Each of those is then further defined through performance indicators. So if I believe that these are qualities of my CBE program, there are criteria associated with those and what it looks like, or the performance indicators at each level. So if you believe that your program would be at an initial level meeting this criteria, for example, if your assessment strategy is clearly articulated and its authenticity is defined. You'd move to emerging if your assessments designed to measure both theory and the ability to apply the theory are authentic and transparently aligned to competencies. You'll see then what it means by developed. Assessments are performance-based when appropriate for the competencies being assessed. So is it matched with that level of learning is what that means. And aligned to requirements in the discipline and profession. Are you industry and employer aligned, workforce aligned, as well as to the overarching assessment strategy. And then you'll see that and highly developed. Each of those levels of performance encompass the one before it. So if you're at a developed level or your program is at a developed level for that particular criterion, you would assume the level before it is present as well. So that is, again, the structure of how the quality framework is built and how it can be used. And we'll show you what each of those elements are, but I just wanted to, again, unpack that structure for you so that when you use and reference the quality framework, hopefully it will make sense to you. Element number 1, and again, this structure is present for every single one of these elements. Every single one of these elements I'm about to show you has the element, the principle, the standards, and then those performance indicators. How do you know where you fall on quality for that particular element? So element number 1 is about demonstrated institutional commitment to and capacity for CBE innovation. Is your program or institution ready, right? Where are your leadership? What kind of capacity do you have? What does your faculty model look like? There are a lot of considerations, and there are a lot of great tools, both through the quality framework, as well as some of the other resources available on CBEN's website, actually, to assess whether or not your institution is ready for CBE and whether you have the capacity to be creative in creating a CBE program or credential. Something that's very important, that all of that is in place and there to support CBE innovation. Element number 2 is that there are clear, measurable, meaningful, and integrated competencies, right? So do you have an identified competency set? Are they clearly defined in a way that makes them measurable? Are they meaningful in industry and the workforce? Are they integrated? Do they work together, right? So a competency set, even though you have discrete competencies, how do they work together in real life? And do your assessments mirror that, for example? Coherent program and curriculum design. So does your learning journey lead to success in the workplace ultimately, right? Does it lead to successful performance and earning in pursuit of a particular credential? Do you have micro credentials that build upon each other into a larger credential? Does your curriculum, was your curriculum designed with a backward design process? Is it coherent, right? Are there clear learning pathways? So again, there's an element there to support coherent program and curriculum design. How are your assessments sprinkled throughout your learning journey, for example? Element number 4, credential level assessment strategy with robust implementation. Is your assessment strategy designed at both the program level and all the way down to the course level, right, within the courses? How do you benchmark progress? What are your formative and summative assessments? How is that data being used? How is that assessment strategy being implemented? Is it consistent across faculty? Does it have reliability and validity? So element number 4 is a big element as well when you're considering CBE around that assessment strategy and how you implement that. Element number 5 is about intentionally designed and engaged learner experience. This looks at, modality, intentional design, explicit delivery. How do you engage that learner? How do you ensure an experience that leads to success? Element number 6, collaborative engagement with external partners. How do you work with workforce partners? How do you engage industry partners? How do you engage industry stakeholders? And it might not just be industry, right? How do you engage with any relevant stakeholders that you need to bring to the table? So really looking at, I'll show you here in a minute, we even have an employer toolkit looking at how do I engage those employers. So there are a lot of resources to be found and absolutely there for your use. But this is one, again, element of quality when using the quality framework. Transparency of student learning. So again, are we teaching to the test? No, absolutely not, right? But we are transparent about learning, what's expected, what the outcomes are going to be, what you're purchasing, right? So when you purchase a learning experience, you want to know what you're going to get from that purchase, right? You are hoping to purchase a very explicit set of outcomes to meet your goals as a learner. So transparency of student learning is absolutely a quality indicator of a quality CBE program. So element number 7 is around that transparency of student learning and what that means and what it looks like. Evidence-driven continuous improvement process. So again, looking at the data, digging into the data, how do you use that to continuously improve your program, your credential, your courses, your learner experience, your enrollment process. Everything is based on the data and really that continuous improvement cycle that is ongoing in order to improve all the learner experience, learner outcomes, program outcomes, anything related to that. So element number 8 is all about that evidence-driven continuous improvement process. So again, that quality framework for competency-based education programs is an excellent resource. And this is what it looks like. So when you access it through CBEN's website, you'll see there on the left, it's something you can actually print, have with you. There's examples associated with these different elements. And it goes through each of those elements very clearly, giving you both those, the principle, the standards, and then those performance indicators of what it looks like. So an example of a CBE design approach, checking my time to make sure we have some time for questions as well. So just to give you an example of what this looks like, we start with those identified competencies, right? So if you were building a program or a credential strategy, oftentimes you'll start with a competency map with levels of mastery. So for example, what you see on your screen here is one competency area, and this is again just one way of building it. People use different terminology. You'll hear different lexicon used. You'll see different hierarchies of what's considered a competency or a sub-competency or a performance indicator. The field is really working on lexicon, I think, so we're all speaking the same language, but this is one example. So if you saw to the left there, the competency area of teamwork, for example, the definition for this particular example was that I can make valued contributions within a group or team situation. I collaboratively work with other people and across groups to ensure diverse perspectives and input are considered. That's just an umbrella definition, right? Those are not the indicators. Those are not the criteria. That's just saying this is what I mean by it. Oftentimes when we create levels of mastery, we're talking to stakeholders. We're saying, if I'm talking to the learner, if I'm talking to parents, if I'm talking to employer partners, I need to be able to say what I mean by teamwork, right? What does that look like for my organization, for my graduate, for my level of learner? And then you continue with levels of performance or levels of mastery at targeted levels. So again, as an example, for level 1, you might look at developing. What does it look like if you're emerging in that particular competency or you're developing that particular competency? What does it look like at a level 2 when you've developed that competency or you have a foundational level of that competency? Or level 3 when you're highly developed or advanced? You'll see different levels of performance labeled differently. You'll see here we even have level 1, level 2, level 3, developing, developed, highly developed, emerging, foundational, advanced. You'll see different ways of leveling performance, like academic levels, right? This is what we mean at an associate's level or certificate level, an associate's level, a bachelor's level, a graduate level, a postgraduate level. And you'll see that in more of like an academic pipeline. You'll see an employment pipeline. For example, the healthcare program in the state of Tennessee I was referencing earlier, we use frontline worker, right? So we use a not yet proficient, frontline worker level, supervisor level, executive manager level. It's an employment pathway or an employment pipeline. We use the levels of mastery tool to communicate with employer partners or the workforce. So we have a more of an employment-based or an industry-based labeling system. Either way, what you're doing is you're identifying that competency area, you're defining that competency area in an umbrella way. I'm just creating a way to communicate with stakeholders, right? This is what I mean by it. But then I'm going to give very specific levels of performance. So the fact that somebody can, for example, hold individual team members accountable, establish a consensus system utilizing interactive team communication, facilitating positive synergistic team outcomes by adeptly matching individual team member competencies to project requirements. Those are all the indicators of whether somebody is proficient in that competency area, whether you know it when you see it, right? That's saying when somebody is proficient in teamwork at a level 2 or a developed level, frontline worker level, foundational level, whatever you want to again label that, we're saying this is what it looks like. This is what performance looks like. So you'll often see when developing programs, you'll see competency maps like this. Again, there's no one right way. They look different across programs, but you might see competency maps similar to this, where levels of performance at different levels are defined. You'll see assessment strategies. So going back to that element number 4, what does the overall strategy look like, right? What do those formative strategies look like? What does that summative assessment look like? Just approaching that design and what am I going to be asking that learner to do? And what are the appropriate ways of measuring that at different points in the learner journey? What do I need to know at what particular point in that learner journey in order to know that learner is progressing and learning gaps are not growing? And then we move to that learning journey outline. So you'll see here that we went from identifying those competencies and defining what it looks like at the different levels of performance, determining how we were going to measure that with an assessment strategy, Then we back into the third stage of backward design, and we talk about, or we design the way that learning journey is going to look. So you'll see on the right side of the screen there, how there is an outline. So for example, the different modules have been defined, what's going to be covered in each module by topic, not by page, right? But if for example, I was designing a course, and I might say there are 4 to 6 modules that are going to be in this course based on what my competency set is, how those are defined, how I'm going to measure those. Now I'm going to design my learning journey. These are the modules I'm going to need, the chunks of content. Again, people call those different things. These are the topics that are going to have to be covered. These are the types of activities that they're going to have to engage in order to build a learner towards performance in that particular area. You'll see on the left side of your screen, that's where the learning journey intentionally gets built out before the learner engages in it. That is all the way from, that one actually there, yeah, built out with instruction. So that has the definition of teamwork that was finalized, those level of mastery, what exactly that learner is going to have to do in order to show proficiency. And then you'll see there, part 3 on the right side of the screen, outlined exactly by topic and activity what the learner will need to do to build them towards that. This is just a snapshot of what it looks like and how it follows that backward design process. But you'll see on the right side of the screen there that that's just one snippet of module 1, right? So this particular course, for example, was made up of 6 learning modules. The one on the screen here just being that very introduction level of that particular learning content. You'll see here is what I thought was on that screen before. Sorry about that. You'll see here where that learning journey gets built out explicitly. So we had identified the competency set, defined what it meant, said this is exactly what the learner needs to do to show proficiency, outlined the course by topic and activity. This is how we're going to build the learner there. So we pre-designed that. And then you literally build out that learning journey. Page 1, right? So module 1, lesson 1, page 1, this is an introduction to teamwork. Lesson 1, page 2, how are you going to get there, right? You'll see there that there's an example of an activity where where the learner is actually doing a drag and drop activity. Looking at teamwork and a very low level of knowledge acquisition there that would build eventually to performance and demonstration of performance. But either way, that learning journey is explicitly built out page by page. This particular program is actually delivered virtually with some real-time engagement through virtual tools like virtual classroom or Zoom even. But this was an example from a virtual delivery modality. So again, just to kind of wrap up, because I want to give some time for questions. I know we end at 11:45 and I certainly want to answer questions, but please keep in mind that competency-based education, again, there's no one right way. There's just following the quality framework because there are elements of quality when building competency-based education and delivering competency-based education. Always collect data to measure the effectiveness of your model and to always have that improvement process, that continuous improvement process for your program, your learners, your workforce. That's essential. So CBEN's role in the movement, really talking a little bit more about what is CBEN's role? Why are we here? What is our kind of goal and priorities? So CBEN has priorities and the work we're doing from the CBEN side is really just to grow demand, educate, right? CBE 101, what is it? Why is it needed? Why is it relevant? Who's using it? How does it create a common currency? How does it connect to and align with workforce needs? So we're really there to grow that demand, build capacity, put out resources. There are tons of resources on the CBEN website. I'll lead you to a few, but really helping look at how can we work with institutions, organizations, policies, regulations to really help build capacity for competency-based education, and looking at removing those barriers. Even things like federal financial aid, any of those barriers that make it difficult in the current structure, for example, or just at the institution level, the organization level. What are those barriers? Culture shifts, right? It's a shift in thinking, for example. What tools can we provide? So CBEN's priorities and work, again, as a member network, is really to come together and work together to grow demand, build capacity, and remove those barriers. So you'll see many CBEN resources. The one we primarily went over today, because I'd say the one that's most sought after and most used is that quality framework for competency-based education programs. Please visit CBEN's website and look for this quality framework. I reference it very often. It has those 8 elements of quality, and really walks you through what needs to be considered to build, develop, and scale a quality competency-based education program. We have other resources. So as I referenced earlier, there's employer engagement best practices toolkit, for example. It's a resource for institutions of higher ed to establish industry partnerships. How do you go about it? What questions do you ask? How do you engage employer and industry partners? A very valuable resource. Another one, for example, so CBEN has collaboratories where we bring in stakeholders or partners from our member institutions and work as a group throughout the year, typically in certain areas. Like for example, there's an equity collaboratory going on right now. The employer engagement best practices toolkit was created through a collaboratory. I'm currently co-leading an assessment collaboratory that will put assessment tools and resources out at CBE Exchange this year, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. But our collaboratories work together to create tools and resources for the field. You'll see on the right hand of your screen there's a CBEN Collaboratory 4 put out. That's the one that just happened. It's been released, so it's creating CBE pathways. So it's just those insights from CBEN's Employer Engagement Collaboratory. So valuable resources to really dig into and look at, particularly interested in that workforce alignment. Here's an example of the employer engagement return on investment estimator user guide, right? So you can even look into talking about that capacity, the institutional capacity, and are people on board? Oftentimes ROI is a place to start. We all know that, right? So here's one example of employer engagement return on investment estimator user guide, for example, that you can find on CBEN's website. Storytelling. How do you tell your institution or your organization's vision? How do you communicate results of your program? How do you change the conversation about CBE and a CBE program? So really looking at how we, as those interested in CBE or looking to build CBE programs or scale CBE programs, can learn how to tell our stories in ways that audiences can hear and understand what we're talking about. So this is just an example of another toolkit that's been created to provide tools and resources to anyone interested, right? Or even those trying to scale, for example, about CBE story. What is it? How do we talk about it? Why would we want to use it? Why do you want to bring it to your institution? How do we share that vision? If we've already brought it at a certain level and we're looking to scale, how do we communicate the positive results that we've had so far? How do you have that conversation with leadership, for example, or any other stakeholder? So check out the storytelling toolkit as well. Many resources. If you go to CBEN's website, it's cbenetwork.org. There's a resources tab, and it brings up a whole resource library. You can search the library, there's topics, there's tags you can look for. You can really just dig in and, quite honestly, go down many different avenues of resources that one kind of just leads to another. So you'll see there on the left side, or it's on the right side of your screen, but you'll see those little tabs on the left of that image where you can go directly to the quality framework. There's a user's guide for the quality framework. So how do I make sense of it? The strategic storytelling toolkit. And then again, you can browse many more resources through that filter option there on the right. CBE Exchange. If any of you have been there, it's a lot of fun. If you haven't been, join us this year. It's November 9th through 12th. This year, it's planned to be happening in person. It's at the Omni Barton Creek Resort and Spa in Austin, Texas. It is always a lot of fun. If you're able to get there on Tuesday evening, there is a kind of like an opening networking event, and it's just a lot of fun. So many very interesting breakout sessions, invited speakers, a lot of important resources and information you can gain at CBE Exchange. So please join us this year if you're interested. Feel free to reach out. You can certainly learn more at, again, www.cbenetwork.org for all of those resources, or to learn even more about CBE Exchange. So I will stop there and certainly open it up for questions with our last 10 minutes, if that's helpful.
So you can utilize the chat feature to ask questions, or instead of navigating them through the chat, you can raise your hand and we will unmute you.
I see Whitney's comment about institutional commitment and capacity is key to getting a program off the ground. Absolutely agree. So that is one that I think you'd want to even start there when thinking about a CBE program, is where are we at as an institution, and what's possible.
So while people are thinking, but we can obviously take a break before 11:45 too. But so if I'm a faculty member or maybe a dean at a college, and I'm really interested in creating a CBE program for my program, what data is helpful in the beginning to make that decision? So I know there's a variety of institutional data, but maybe external data. Like what kind of data do I need to start collecting to sort of bring that to my institutional leaders for why maybe a CBE program would be a good fit?
That's a great question. And I know this is never an answer people want, but it kind of depends on your learner population, the programs you offer. I think people are always interested in completion data, persistence data, retention data, attrition data, all of those kind of typical keys. And then really just really digging into too, what types of learners are your programs attracting? What types of learners could your programs be, I would say, and if we're speaking specifically to, capacity and return on investment and that sort of thing, I think oftentimes we're talking about how are we bringing in more learners, right? And how are we getting more learners to completion and persistence? So how do we reduce retention? So it's kind of all those key factors with really how could we maybe connect with an employer partner? How could we tap a new learner population? And so I don't know if that answers your question well, but that's certainly a place to start when you're looking at data, is just knowing where you are with your learner numbers and looking for the next opportunity, if that makes sense. Or for example, if right now everything's face-to-face, but you have the opportunity to potentially offer a fully online experience, what could that look like? What learner populations could you reach with that? What kind of accessibility could you offer through that? So that's often a conversation that we find very helpful when making the case, so to speak, for CBE. Does that help answer your question?
It definitely does. And it looks like we don't have any questions in the chat and no one's raised their hand. You've done a great job at, Kathy has posted in the chat, my disaggregated data from program review, which is our program evaluation process, be helpful in making this determination, and then compare that against demographics of the community. And I would definitely think so, to making the case for more equitable outcomes within a particular program in terms of who the program is serving and who it could serve. I think that would be a great way, Kathy.
Certainly. And even that example referenced earlier where I was talking about that full day assessment center, methodology. For example, we really dug into the data of who we were serving, and that we realized, I'll say through the data, our learner population were adult learners with full-time jobs, sometimes multiple jobs. So realizing hours, right? Hours that the content was available, having student supports available in evening hours, for example. I don't know if that speaks directly to your question, but certainly knowing your learner population and what it would take to remove those barriers For learners to make, to make your program more accessible is absolutely making the case for your program and how CBE could fit into that.
How we can create more flexibility for adult learners is key. Yeah, I mean, I think,
Absolutely.
understanding, talk to students, talk to community members, why they're not coming to your program, or maybe why they're not moving through your program at the pace at which they should be, right? What are some of those barriers? And I'm going to guess that you're going to find that CBE is going to help you overcome some of those barriers. And so that could be part of your making the case for this program. All right, well, unless there are any last minute questions, I know Tiffany, you've done an excellent comprehensive job here. That's why we needed an hour and a half for this. Competency-based education is a very complex topic, especially when we're trying to define it. So thank you so much. I appreciate you presenting today and sharing your knowledge with us. We're going to take just a 4-minute break here until we'll start promptly at 11:45 or so, because I know folks are coming in at different session times. So thank you so much, Tiffany, for jumping on today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much for your time. Feel free to visit our website or reach out with any